Thank you, Cameron. Ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by making a very simple statement. The Earth's ecological problems stem largely from our failure to share. Now, that might seem like an oversimplistic statement, but as I will explain, only by sharing the world's resources more equitably and sustainably will we be able to address both the ecological and social crises that we face as a global community. The principle of sharing has always formed the basis of social relationships across the world. We all know from personal experience that sharing is central to family and community life. And the principle of sharing is also an important component of many of the world's religions. It's also becoming apparent through a growing body of anthropological and biological evidence that human beings are naturally predisposed to cooperate and share in order to improve our collective well-being and maximize our chances of survival. In fact, sharing is much more prevalent in society than we often presume. In a recent report we published, we identified the many emerging and existing forms of sharing that exist as part of what we've termed the sharing economy. And they include, as you can see, systems of welfare, collaborative consumption, cooperatives, knowledge-sharing websites, and many other examples. Given the importance of the principle of sharing in human life, it's logical to assume that it should play an important role in the way we manage the world's resources and organize economies. But unfortunately, this is not quite the case. Instead, we have created an economic system based on ideologies that are entirely opposed to the principle of sharing. For decades, mainstream economists and policymakers have based their decision-making on a distorted understanding of what it means to be human. That people are selfish, acquisitive, competitive, individualistic, etc. The concept of homo economicus. These notions are used to justify the exaggerated role that market forces play in our societies. And as we know, neoliberal ideology still dominates policymaking across the world, characterized by the privatization of common resources, the deregulation and liberalization of markets, and the endless pursuit of economic growth and resource consumption. As a result of failing to put sharing at the center of policymaking, we now face many of the grave environmental crises that we're discussing this morning. From climate change to pollution, deforestation, peak energy, the list is long, and many of the other speakers have touched on these things. Underpinning these multiple ecologies is the failure of governments to achieve a balance between consumption and the Earth's life-supporting capacity. As the World Wildlife Fund have painstakingly demonstrated, humanity currently consumes 50% more resources than the Earth can sustainably produce, which means we already require an equivalent of 1.5 planet Earths to support our current consumption levels. And of course, this doesn't take into account the growth in consumption that is expected to take place over the next few decades, where the global middle class is expected to grow from under 2 billion as it stands today to around 5 billion by 2030. And the ecological consequences of increased consumption will obviously be severe. According to research by the Stockholm Resilience Centre, we've already transgressed 3 of the 9 key planetary boundaries, which include climate change, biological diversity, and nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. But our failure to share resources has also resulted in a severe social crisis, which cannot be divorced from any discussion about the environment. Ecological chaos, poverty, and inequality are related outcomes of an ill-managed world system, and they require simultaneous attention. This is a fact obviously embodied in the contemporary dialogue on sustainable development. And as you can see from the slide, there are massive differences in the consumption patterns of people living in rich countries and those living in poor. A tiny proportion of the world's population, around 10%, consume the vast majority of the world's natural resources. And the overconsumption of this small group of wealthy consumers poses the biggest threat to the environment today. At the same time, the poorest 20% of the world's population do not have access to the basic resources that we all take for granted today. Around 1 billion people, as we know, are classified hungry, and almost half the developing world live on less than $2 a day. Some 40,000 people die every single day from a lack of resources, preventable deaths. And this, of course, is perhaps the most starkest illustration of our failure to share. Given the urgency of the ecological and social situation, why are we still failing to manage the world's resources in a more equitable and sustainable way? Every year, numerous international conferences take place. But the international community has not managed to reduce CO2 emissions. We have failed to curb unsustainable patterns of resource consumption. We have not managed to end poverty or pave the way for sustainable development. And in the meanwhile, endless reports have been written that recommend a sensible path forward for the international community, but they're not taken seriously by policymakers. Nothing seems to change. Humanity is at an impasse. We seem unable to overcome the vested interest and the structural barriers to growth, barriers to progress that we face. For too long, governments have put profit and growth before the welfare of people and the sustainability of the biosphere. Public policy under the influence of neoliberalism has created a world economy that is structurally dependent upon unsustainable levels of production and consumption for its continued success. Overcoming these vested interests and overcoming the barriers to progress remain one of the largest challenges of the 21st century, as widely regarded by campaigners across the world. Now, given the task ahead and the extensive international negotiations these reforms will involve, I'm sure you will all agree it's impossible at this stage to put forward a blueprint for the specific policies and actions governments need. However, in order to inspire public support for transformative change, it is possible to outline a bold vision of how and why these reforms should be based firmly on the principle of sharing. Sharing the world's resources equitably and sustainably is perhaps the most pragmatic way of simultaneously addressing both the ecological and social crises we face. Two basic elements remain fundamental to creating a global sharing economy. The first element is for the international community to recognize that natural resources form part of our shared commons and should therefore be held in trust for the benefit of all. This important reconceptualization would enable humanity to move away from today's private and state ownership models and towards a new form of resource management based on non-ownership and trusteeship. A precedent for sharing natural resources is already well established. An existing principle in international law known as the common heritage of humankind enables certain cultural and natural resources to be protected from exploitation from both the state and the private sector by holding them in trust for future generations. And as you can see from the slide, this principle is an important feature in a number of treaties that exist at the international level that have taken shape under the UN. And of course, there are many options available for how such a trust could be organized on a global level to incorporate the full range of renewable and non-renewable resources, including fossil fuels. For example, a number of proposals already exist and have been put forward by people you may have heard of, James Killigan, Peter Barnes, or there's a book I would highly recommend, Right Relationship, by Peter Brown and Jeffrey Garver. The slide briefly outlines how such a trust could function, but in the interest of time, I won't go into that in detail. Let me just reiterate that essentially a global commons trust would embody the principle of sharing on a global scale, and it would enable the international community to take collective responsibility for managing the world's resources. With resources held in trust, it would be much easier to implement the second element required to establish a global sharing economy, which is to equalize global consumption levels so that all human beings can flourish within ecological limits. To achieve this, over-consuming countries need to significantly reduce their resource use, while developing countries must be able to increase theirs until a convergence is eventually reached over time. The real challenge, of course, is reducing consumption in industrialized nations, and many proposals already exist for how to achieve this. For example, it's clear that resource management would have to be placed at the forefront of policy making. We'd have to move beyond economic growth and GDP as objectives of economic policy, and we need to dismantle the culture of consumerism. With both these key elements in place, natural resources would be accessible to people in all countries, consumed within planetary limits, and preserved for future generations. But how will these changes take place? Regardless of the specific policies employed, the world still lacks a broad-based acceptance of the need for planetary reconstruction. Without a global movement of ordinary people that share a collective vision for change, it will remain impossible to overcome the influence of neoliberal policy and the vested interest that I mentioned earlier. But there is hope. As summarized yesterday by the presentation given by Mr. Takaya Ateyov, the historic events of 2011 provided concrete evidence of the potential power of a united people's voice. The world witnessed millions of people in diverse countries declaring their needs and pointing the way to a more just, sustainable, and hopeful future. The Arab Spring demonstrated the awesome power of a focused and directed public opinion. In city squares across the developed world, the Occupy movement, Indignados, and a host of other movements focused the world's media on the plight of the 99% and gained widespread public support in the process. The rapid spread of these mass demonstrations reflects a growing recognition of humanity's innate unity, and they pay testimony to the combined power of engaged citizens. But if public opinion is to make transformative change a reality, a crucial next step is to adopt a common and inclusive platform for change on a global scale. In other words, we need a planetary scale Tahrir Square. Social injustice and ecological crisis must be recognized as inextricable parts of the same problem, our failure to share the world's resources. A universal call for sharing has the potential to unite both these causes and create a more sustainable, just, and peaceful world. Thank you.